Welcome back to the Poor Proles Almanac. This is Andy, and today we have the privilege of speaking with Ethan Tapper, a distinguished forester, author, and advocate for sustainable forest stewardship. Based in Vermont, Ethan's journey into forestry began after a transformative wilderness expedition. This led him to study at the University of Vermont and later serve as the Chittenden County Forester. In this role, he became known for his innovative public outreach, engaging thousands through educational events, columns, and digital content. His dedication to forest conservation has earned him numerous accolades, including the 2024 National Tree Farm Inspector of the Year Award from the American Tree Farm System. 2024 was a busy year for Ethan. He also transitioned to founding Bear Island Forestry, a consulting firm focused in responsible forest management. However, you might know him for another reason. He also published his debut book, How to Love a Forest, The Bittersweet Work of Tending a Changing World, which explores the complexities of forest care and our evolving relationship with nature. And that's what we're talking about today. We dive into Ethan's experiences in the woods, his insights on forest management, and the inspirations behind his writing. This was a fun conversation. I think you guys will enjoy it. Let us know what you think. Ethan, thanks so much for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and what drove you to decide, I need to write this book?
Well, it's been a process. I've been working as a forester now for about 12 years, mostly in Vermont. And there was just a lot of stuff that I wanted to talk about. And I mean, the biggest thing that we encounter when we think about ecosystems, for those of us who really work in, and care for these ecosystems, is the reality, right? That they're facing all these incredible threats and stressors.
Yeah.
These legacies of the past, non-native invasive plants, animals, and insects, pests, and pathogens, fear overpopulation, climate change, forest fragmentation, deforestation, pollution. You can run down the list. Actually, refer to those threats and stressors collectively as global change.
Mm-hmm.
So they're dealing with this volume of threats and stressors. And, for those of us who maybe know a little bit about forests and like to walk in the forest, and they're like, these places are beautiful and they're perfect and they're pristine. And once you really dig into where they're at,
Mm.
and where they are in this moment, you start to realize that they need help.
Yeah.
Not in every single case, but in a lot of cases, there are things that we can do to help them, and then by extension, our biodiversity and all of these things that we rely on forests to, like clean air, clean water, climate regulation, all that stuff. Ultimately, we rely on these ecosystems. So what I was seeing a lot of folks, with this idea that the only way that we can care for forests and their ecosystems is to leave them alone, right? And part of that's based on the fact that last couple hundred years in this continent have not done a good job managing these ecosystems in general, and we see a lot of exploitation of them, right? And but what that does not mean is that we are incapable of caring for them. And I really wanted to write a book that told that story about some of these incredibly nuanced and complex realities, these actions that we can take, these things that we can do to care for forests, and how those things, even something as counterintuitive as cutting a tree, can be this radical act of care for these ecosystems in this moment.
Yeah, it's a beautiful book, and you do a really good job of weaving some ecology education into these really interesting stories about your experiences as a forester. You do this thing in the book where you italicize any keyword. So does have a little bit of that academic, educational, pedagogical component without it being distracting, which I think sometimes happens a lot with books like this, where it's kind of beating it over the head, and you don't really do that, which I really appreciated. And I think it is, you bring up some really interesting thoughts and philosophical points about how you felt and your own reservations about the things that you rationally believe based on the most recent science, but also you're if I'm going against the grain, I better know what the hell I'm talking about. And that's really frightening and daunting. And that humility in the process, I think, is really important in engaging as a reader, engaging with it instead of feeling hey, everything you know about environmentalism is wrong, you stupid idiot. You're not doing that at all. You're hey, here's what science says, and this is what I'm trying to do. And I could be wrong, but I'm going to try, and I'm nervous that I might be wrong, but we're going to see what happens. And that's really nice.
Yeah, I mean, I say something in the book, the effect of if we wait to be perfect, we will do nothing at all.
Yeah.
And it's like, I think that in this moment, we got to have the humility, to understand like we don't fully understand ecosystems. They're incredibly complex, but we do know a lot about them, and we can take action and we can do our best and then have the humility, to recognize that there still may need to be adaptation on our part and resilience on our part. And, not everything's going to work out perfect, but that doesn't mean that we just do nothing because we're too scared of making the wrong move.
Yeah.
Sometimes I say, when I talk about like a lot of the books woven around my own land, which I call Bear Island, which is like the most degraded, when I got to it, was the most degraded forest I'd ever been to. One of the things that I say as I was sort of, I'm standing on this log landing, surrounded by this incredibly degraded forest, is that I had to ask myself, right, if it would be a greater act of compassion to just like leave this forest alone and hope for the best, hope nature, in air quotes, will take care of everything, or if I was going to do everything in my power to try and make this place healthy again. And one of my superpowers in this effort, I believe, is the fact that I am not a purist. And I will not let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Yeah.
Because I know that even if our actions are imperfect, that still they're going to be so much better than if we just do nothing at all, and just let these ecosystems continue to collapse and be degraded. We have the potential to do a lot of good. And then the other part of it is folks ask me, I have this story on my land of like 30 years ago, these loggers came and they did what we call high grading on the forest. So they basically cut all the most valuable trees, left all the least valuable trees behind. Those most valuable trees, the high grade trees, are also usually the healthiest trees in the forest. So what they did was basically like manage the forest to be less healthy, right? So like what I compare it to is it would be like if you go out to your vegetable garden in the middle of summer and there's a bunch of vegetables and a bunch of weeds and you weed out all the vegetables. Like that's what this felt like really.
Yeah.
And so, but the question that I get asked is like, we look back at these actions that were taken historically on our landscape, and we're like, these people were so short-sighted. They didn't know what they were doing. And how do we know that 30 years from now, that the next generation isn't going to be looking at us and saying the same thing, right? With all these things I'm trying to do to restore these ecosystems. And there's a bunch of different reasons why. One is that I have the humility to acknowledge that these ecosystems are like a thing in and of themselves and caring about them as they are and not just what I can extract from them, which is a fundamentally different mindset than how they've been approached in the past. But the other thing I hope is that we will have the humility to recognize that we like don't have all the answers and that we don't, we're not just going to impose this like totally anthropocentric mindset on these ecosystems that's solely based on like seeing them as a commodity. Instead, we're going to like take a step back and recognize that we're not going to do the right thing all the time. And we're going to do our best though. And we're going to keep learning and evolving and adapting. And that's what's going to make us different.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. And I think you really sum it up with like the discussion around invasive species and that you actually go through the process of talking about using, was it glyphosate they use?
Glyphosate, yeah.
So you admit like, I hope this is the right decision, but I'm going to own it, whether or not it's the right decision. I understand why people don't agree with it. I also understand why people do agree with it, which is obviously why I'm doing it. But like this greater, this ownership of potentially failing, which I think is really refreshing in a particular, especially like in a social media era where people like you and me get book deals because we have a social media. You know what I mean? Like that is a major component of how books will be, identified as sellable moving into the future, whether or not we like it, which means that we end up having to feel like we have to have this very refined existence. And like any mistake means people unfollow you, which means that your future book won't sell or whatever it might be. Right. So like, admitting that you may be wrong and that this is the thing I'm going to do and whether or not it's the right thing to own it is really important because we do have this generational issue of like things are hard and there's no easy answer. So I'm just going to kind of punt it and have, give a very mealy-mouthed excuse why I don't have to do anything. And like that's an issue I have with some of the and this is kind of going a little off track, but I think it does matter, is like a lot of like the land back stuff. Like, I don't disagree with it, but I feel like it is kind of an excuse for some people to just say, like, white people screwed it up. We should hand over the ownership to indigenous people, which I don't disagree with. But in the reality that that's not going to probably happen in any immediate future, we still have a responsibility in the meantime to try to undo the damages done. But that messy reality sometimes gets missed in that social media space that you kind of openly engage with in the book, which again, I think is really important. Even if people disagree, it's like, all right, this is the first step to like a real conversation about this instead of hot takes and gotcha moments.
Yeah, the hot takes thing is bizarre. And I find that all the time where, yeah, it just feels like a hot take is used as a surrogate for just really not having a take, and really just not wanting to engage with the reality of something that's complicated,
Yeah.
right? And because again, it's the fear is like you start to inject some nuance into that conversation. Like you start to say, I used herbicide to control these non-native plants, and you're shouted down before you even get a chance to do what I did, which was, write about it for however many 20 pages or something, about this whole situation. And it is a thing. There's a lot, like we could probably talk about non-native invasive plants this whole time because there is a lot of interesting stuff about them and interesting stuff that it like does to people's brains when they think about them.
Yeah.
And, one of the things about the herbicide that's interesting is, basically every conservation organization that manages these plants at scale uses herbicide, right? But the optics are so bad that no one talks about it,
No.
right? And then it creates this situation where then it's like the perception is this is not happening.
Yeah.
And so then when people hear about it happening, they freak. It's sort of like even if something is hard, even if explaining something takes some nuance, if we're doing it, if we believe in it, if we're like, we've had this conversation of which is worse, the invasives or the herbicide. We've had this conversation of can we do this in a way that protects our soils, our waters, our biodiversity, but like behind closed doors,
Mm.
right? Because we're so scared to talk about this nuanced issue. And then the result is that we don't celebrate it. People don't know it's happening. And I'm like, if we're doing it, if we've made this decision, we should be talking about it and we should be celebrating it. It goes for a lot of different things.
And to that point, sorry, I'm going to cut you off just really quickly on this
Yeah.
because I think it pairs really well with exactly what you're saying. Is that what ends up happening is the only people talking about it are the people who don't like it.
Mm-hmm.
So when people talk about utilizing stuff like glyphosate, I'm not going to say that right now. Glyphosate.
Yeah.
You have people like Teo Orion writing The War on Invasive Species, and they direct the narrative. The same way, like when we watch politics, like whatever party is in power, the other party tries to direct the narrative about what's happening to the country, right? It's because when you're in power, you're accountable and can be criticized. When you're not in power, then you are the one that can criticize everyone else because no one's paying attention to you. It's like, no, look at what these people are doing that's bad, and we control the narrative. And, you read that book, The War on Invasive Species, she makes it sound like they're just spraying this stuff from helicopters, like we're like an actual war where we're just like saying this 100 acres, we're just going to spray it. No questions, who gives a shit what's down there. And that's not what's happening. Like, it's not.
Right.
And that becomes a really big problem because that's the only person directing that narrative.
Right. Well, yeah. And it is very interesting, like psychologically, that, invasive plants, but I say that this is how I describe it often, that invasive plants and the measures necessary to control them are an inconvenient truth. Right. And I use that in particular because sometimes, when people are so uncomfortable with what would be necessary to control these plants, right, including the use of herbicide at times, and instead of squaring up to that, and really thinking about it, they approach it from a lens of like confirmation bias, right, where they're like, it makes me uncomfortable, just like climate change makes people uncomfortable. And what information can I find that will affirm the thing I already feel? What expert can I find that will corroborate this feeling that I have? And you can find someone who can corroborate just about anything.
Mm.
So then you take this framework of like people not wanting to deal with the reality of the situation and then flocking to anyone who will tell them that it's not a problem or will tell them our ecosystems are going to adapt to these non-native invasive plants in any meaningful amount of time. Or we'll tell them that they're climate resilient, so we should keep them, or they have medicinal value to humans, so we should keep them. All of
Or
these,
photosynthesis. Yeah.
yeah, or they're whatever. And it's just like, I wish that instead of doing that, we could like really ask the question. And it's the same, it's the same that I end up dealing with when I talk about the other things I talk about in the book, like cutting trees and killing deer, which is like, instead of just reacting to this, can we just like look at it for a second,
Mm.
and can we just like, instead of initially being like, this is how I feel about it, now let me like reverse engineer a reason why I feel this way. Let's like accept the possibility that the fact that something makes us uncomfortable like doesn't mean that it's wrong. And there might actually be information about it out there that shows us that actually, even though it makes us uncomfortable, that it might be a thing that we actually really need to do. And that's sort of what the whole book is about.
Yeah. I mean, when you were talking about hunting the deer for the first time, at least since you were, it sounded like a child or something like that, that process, which as somebody who has butchered livestock, like I'm very familiar with that first initial kill and the realization of like, I am 100% responsible for this animal's death. It's not like going to the grocery store where it's like this animal was killed whether or not I was going to eat it. Now the question is, if I don't eat it, will it get thrown away? And do I have a moral responsibility in that sense to eat it? Since like it sacrificed its life. Instead, you're completely cutting out that middleman and having to own that moment. And even as somebody who can rationalize, which I think most people can rationalize, at least the people that eat meat, why it's necessary to do that, owning it 100% and owning the risks of suffering and all the other components that come with it is a very heavy burden that I think is really important for everyone, especially people that eat meat at least, to experience once, whether or not it's deer or some other animal, to understand the gravity of their decisions, even if it's a one-time thing, just to claim some ownership of that, I think is really important.
Mm.
And you kind of go through that a bit. So up in Vermont, though, to speak to the deer, like I know, and if when I talk to different people in different parts of the country, populations are like from 50 per square mile to 200 per square mile, depending on where
Yeah.
people live. And for context, I believe most ecologists suggest that like less than 5 is the ideal amount of deer, somewhere around there. And it depends on the ecosystem and
Yeah.
all those other components. How bad is it in Vermont right now, if you happen to know?
It's not that bad compared to most of the country. I mean, I think we have less than 40 per square mile. And in some parts of the state, like we have this northeastern part of the state that's pretty boreal. And, in there it's like way lower. But in other parts of the state, we think that we can sustain like 18 to 20 per square mile. In these degraded ecosystems, that's where you see they want to lower it to like 5 to 8 to let that ecosystem recover. And then maybe in some, future world, they could sustain more like 15, 18. But yeah, I mean, it's not that bad, but it's also more than our landscape can sustain.
Yeah, it's still too many.
It's still too many, and they eat an enormous amount, especially in the wintertime, of these young trees and shrubs and plants as well. And they can totally change the composition of a forest, and by eating some species of trees and not eating others, they might change the composition of that forest for centuries, which is wild to think about, and
Mm.
it's the situation is basically as it is across the country, like those overpopulations are driven by a few different things, right? They're driven by predator extirpation. Here it was like wolves and the eastern cougar, what we call in Vermont the catamount. And then also other things like decreasing winter severity, which used to be a big driver of, keeping that population in check. And then a bunch of other stuff related to the inability of its current predator, which is apex predator, which is humans, to regulate that population. So that's things like suburbanization, uh, posted land where people can't hunt, things like that, and really crashing hunter numbers.
Mm.
So those are things that basically humans are the apex predator of this animal now, and our ability to limit those populations and to keep them low is is diminished by those other things. But something that's interesting in most of white-tailed deer's range is that white-tailed deer, the research suggests that once you get above about 40 deer per square mile, that recreational hunting alone is no longer an effective means to control that population. So what that means is you got to do something more drastic. You got to do culls, right? CULL culls. Like you got to call in snipers and go kill a bunch of deer. And then there's, of course, a lot of social resistance to that. There's social resistance to the impacts of the deer overpopulation with like deer car collisions and tick-borne disease, and people can't grow food in their gardens, and farmers can't grow food in their fields, right? And then there's also resistance to the measures necessary to control them. And so people try to treat it symptomatically, and they treat it with deer exclosures, and they try to sterilize them. And ultimately, all of that is just to get ourselves off the hook of having to deal with the fact that we got to call in these snipers and go kill hundreds of deer. But ultimately, that to me is such a greater act of kindness to everything and to the deer themselves.
You don't think it's good for them to starve to death?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one of the things like people say when deer get overpopulated, they get smaller, they get in poorer condition. And what that is that there's so many of them that they've stripped all the most nutritious food off the landscape, in addition to anything like spreading disease and stuff like that. But that's why they get smaller. They've eaten all the most nutritious food. And, I'd rather have a smaller population of deer that was healthier and not suffering than a large population of deer that is completely unhealthy, and completely out of whack. In addition to their, the fact that they're driving essentially ecosystem collapse and, really diminishing forests' ability to be resilient and to be healthy, and really diminishing their ability to provide habitat for literally tens of thousands of species of other organisms.
Yeah. So I think what's really interesting, though, that you've brought up is that like people don't want to cull these deer, despite like these very clear and objectively like good reasons that like we don't want them to suffer. We also want to have all these things that the deer are making not possible, right?
Mm.
And it kind of goes back to the whole thing we just were talking about at the beginning of this with social media, like this mealy-mouthed, I don't want any of these, but I refuse to like own the fact that one of these things has to happen. Like somebody else needs to make this decision, and if it's the wrong one, or even no matter what it is, I'm going to criticize it because I'm not happy with either of them.
Mm.
Like given the recent election, that feels like really poignant. Like this whole, like I don't like either of these answers, and I don't want to have to put my name on either of them, but I'm going to criticize anyone that does because like there's no real alternative. It is like very symptomatic of, I guess, the world we've developed into, that we just like are incapable of tackling difficult questions.
Yeah, I think it is. I don't know. It makes me think of a few different things. One thing it makes me think of, and I wish I could remember who said this, but someone was talking about how maybe a freedom that we've lost is the freedom to not have a take on something.
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of stuff we just don't know that much about,
Yeah.
right? And we don't know enough about it to really comment on it. But we feel like if we don't say something about it, that we're going to be criticized also for that.
Yeah.
Right. When really what we should do is, like listen and try to engage with the nuance of it rather than just feeling like, I have to post something on my Instagram story about this thing, or people are going to be like, why didn't you have a take on this thing?
Yeah. And why wasn't it the right one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I thought of is I like this podcast, Hidden Brain. On Hidden Brain recently, they had a scientist come on who's talking about ambivalence,
Mm-hmm.
and the wisdom of ambivalence in a way where we think about it as something that's like a weakness.
Yeah.
That, we have to feel like just one thing about something. We have to know exactly how we feel about it. And really, like, there's a lot of wisdom in acknowledging that we can feel a lot of different things about something, and that's, actually so much more of a real expression or a real reaction to the complexities of where we're at. But that is also something that's like hard to express in the kind of like little bites that we're trying to do that.
Yeah. It's a strange time to be alive. I'll say that.
Yeah.
So one of the things I think this also points to that you talk about in the book, and I'm actually going to quote you for a second. So you said in the book, we cannot choose if we want to impact ecosystems, but rather what we want that impact to be. And I think that like really points to like the whole thing with deer, with invasive species, with endemic species and protecting them, with how do we, and you didn't really go into this in the book, so I'm kind of curious about your thoughts about ecosystem restoration given climate change and climate refugees.
Mm.
Like, we have a footprint, whether or not we want to own it. How do we wrestle with that? Yeah, I don't really have a question on the quote
Yeah.
because I think we've talked about it quite a bit, but I am interested about your thoughts about like what does that mean in a world of climate refugees?
Yeah. I mean, well, so
And I'll just clarify, I'm speaking about plants, not like people.
sure. Well, so to that, the point in that quote in general, right? Like it's another sort of thing, sort of like that dichotomy I talked at the beginning, that we can just be like, hands off these ecosystems, you're over here and we're over here, and that's how we're going to care for you. I really think that we just need to acknowledge that like they're not separate, right? We like literally are sustained by ecosystems, and everything that we do has an impact on them. Everything we eat, everything we consume, everything we wear, every bit of energy that we consume has an impact on ecosystems, and we just need to like know that rather than to pretend that that's not happening. And we also got to make compromises, like everybody loves a beautiful little home, and everybody loves an agricultural field, and all of those things are the site of like a drained wetland or a clear cut forest, right? And those are things that we recognize as necessary compromises to sustain our lives and to hopefully sustain like lives that are beautiful and worth living, and full of all the best things in the world. But we just need to acknowledge that. And one place that I really think about that in the forestry world is like with wood, and because that's another thing where like we're managing these ecosystems. A lot of times I manage ecosystems and I'm doing ecosystem restoration. I'm producing wood in the process. And that it's actually really interesting because not only is that a local renewable resource, which we say we want more of,
Mm-hmm.
but it's also a resource that can be harvested while you're helping these ecosystems heal and while you're helping them become more like old growth forests and providing these habitats underrepresented across our landscape, and which are foundational habitat for all of our biodiversity. And in that case, it's like the best thing imaginable, right? But it's a compromise. It always will be. And I think our what we should be trying to do is to look for ways to have an impact that is positive while also getting the stuff that we need. For me, forest
Yeah.
management can be, it's not always certainly, but can be an example of that rather than looking for ways to just like not impact ecosystems, which isn't even possible anyway. I'd rather be recognizing that impact, owning it, and then and trying to do stuff that does that in the best way possible.
Yeah.
And oh, I have one more quote that
Good.
that is really special to me from the book that makes me think of that, which is from the last chapter. And I have it memorized because whenever I do a reading for the book, I always read this reading at the end. And it says, "This world is not ours to hold, that we hold it anyway."
Yeah.
And it's one of these things where it's like, yeah, like, we're in this biosphere and surrounded by these ecosystems and all this stuff that's beautiful and has its own life to live and is intrinsic value. Sure, we can talk all day long about how we shouldn't have sovereignty over all these things, or we shouldn't be able to like dominate all these things, and they shouldn't be subservient to us, or whatever language you want to use. But like here we are, and we are the organism that basically, holds the fate of this world in its hands. And so we can pretend, and we can be like use these like philosophies to sort of get ourselves off the hook from that reality, or we can just be like, yeah, we are dependent on these ecosystems, and in this moment they actually might be dependent on us.
Yeah. And I think, we talk about like regenerative or sustainable energy, and that forest can do that. But it also points to the fact that, we have to acknowledge the very simple reality that we consume too much.
Yeah.
Like, it's very easy to point to the past and say, I can't believe you cut down these great trees. But that was energy that they needed to use to build their homes, the homes that many of us live in today.
Mhm.
And yeah, I'm not saying that there wasn't any waste, because there absolutely was, but they were no more or less flawed than we are. but we also now know more and have a responsibility to the world around us to be less flawed,
Mm,
that we don't have the luxury of environment and ecosystem that can absorb our mistakes anymore
mm,
because of population and just energy consumption per person. Like you think about what is it? I don't know the date off the top of my head, but it's like in the last 2 decades, we've consumed more energy than like the last 500.
wow.
So even like the last, you know, going 30 years back, that was, a drop in the bucket compared to what we're consuming today. So it's not as simple, oh, they were idiots back then, or, they were stupid, they didn't understand. We know better. We can just make these changes to our land management practices, but it's part of a bigger, more comprehensive understanding of our relationship with the world around us and ownership of the decision making instead of just kind of
Mm,
pinning it on abstract ideas or concepts about, oh well, I have no control over what BP does. Like, yeah, that's true, but also like
mhm.
how much crap do you buy that you don't really need too?
Yeah.
You can criticize one and also acknowledge your own shortfalls, and I'm not saying that I'm above it myself.
Yeah, it's like it actually you mentioned BP, it reminded me of it. I read this book called Saving Us by Catherine Hayhoe, and she talks about the fact that I think it was in 89 maybe that the individual climate carbon footprint or there's the carbon footprint calculator was actually created by BP,
Yes.
right? And that was a means to be like sort of lay all this stuff at the feet of the individual, right? And distract from their own oversized impact on the situation. And individuals like individual action has meaning and it is impactful. And we do need to make better choices individually. And also then it's like that and big picture stuff as well.
Yeah. To your point about like the ambivalence, like it's the same thing, like this and that, and they might be diametrically opposite positions, but that doesn't mean they can't both be right in some capacity.
Yeah. Yeah, I talk about that in the book all the time. There's like the forest is like the world of where seemingly contradictory things are true. Where you can have forests that are both competitive and collaborative, altruistic and parasitic, that celebrate life and celebrate death, in ecological terms. And all those things can be true at once. And like that's what's cool about it. That's what, to us, it like breaks our brains and makes us experience all this dissonance. But actually, that's like the best part right there.
Yeah. And I feel like it's a little bit of our brains trying, like, and maybe you can sympathize with this experience of like, if you're in the woods for a long enough time, you feel your brain being different.
Mm,
And like, you feel like the world outside of it almost seems irrational for like a
mm,
split moment before your brain's like, no, you live in a house. Like you do all these things, but like for like a split second, a part of you is like, that seems wrong.
mm,
Even if like you can rationalize that it's not. And I like this idea of like these two oppositional forces making sense in this one unique environment that like we have co-evolved to exist within. I don't know. I think it's really interesting, and I think it's something that I've experienced. And as somebody like you in the book, you talk about like you would go out into the woods with your dog and be out there literally the entire day, not talk to a person.
yeah.
I'm curious, like if you had that same kind of moment, like coming home, where it's almost like this is wrong.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And when I really had it was I talk a little bit about the book and about in the book how I got into this forestry in the first place or being interested in forest and forest ecology. Because when I grew up, I didn't care about it at all. And what happened was that my like high school girlfriend went off when I was in college, just sort of like bumbling around, not knowing what I wanted to study. She went off on this program, this like 5 month wilderness expedition. And then when she came back, she had had this like huge impactful experience. And I had not. And we were just not connecting. And I was afraid we are going to break up. So, like, snap judgment, I was like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going on a wilderness expedition. And the next one left in 2 months or I'm sorry, in 2 weeks. And it was 6 months long. And it was like 3 months skiing north, and you build a canoe and you canoe back down. After that, it changes the way you think about everything. You know what was the most wild thing was becoming so overwhelmed when we went like we're going back into kind of society, the colors. and the brightness and the sound. Couldn't handle it. I remember coming out and looking at a soda cooler, and like it was hurting my eyes to look at like the brightness of the colors on the labels.
Mm,
And going into like a big grocery store, and I had to like run out because it was giving me a splitting headache, just the lights.
yeah.
It was wild. So that, yeah, that has happened to me. And it, I think raises a lot of interesting questions about, what we what we're subjecting our brains to, and
Yeah.
there's for me like another reason why it's such a like an existentially important thing to do to protect these ecosystems, right? Is also because, we know they're important to us like physically and culturally, economically, but also they have all of these other values that are really special. And we want to be able to have like a future where future generations of people can go out there and be in the woods and have that experience.
You talk about in the book putting the land into a land trust, which I think speaks to like this protection of the land.
Mm,
I don't know if you could talk a little bit about what that process was like for people that might be interested in doing something like that.
sure. Yeah, so I put a conservation easement on it, donated a conservation easement. I still own the land,
Sure. Yes.
but what I did is I basically donated away the development rights to a local land trust. And when I was younger, I remember someone asking me about that concept of conservation and permanent conservation with the conservation easement. And I was like, I don't know, forever's a long time. And then just sort of as I grew up a little bit, I started to see that this is like the really the only way to absolutely ensure that this land is still going to be here, in 50 years or 100 years. It's in perpetuity, whatever that means, but it's as long as we can imagine.
As long as the United States exists.
That's right. And as long as like, these systems as we know them exist, but it's really the only way we can be sure. And so it felt like me like giving a gift to future generations. But what it essentially is you work with a land trust usually, and they draft up a document called a conservation easement. And then that easement says what you can do and what you can't do on the land. So I can't subdivide the land. I can't develop it. I could build like an agricultural structure. I couldn't convert it to some other use. There are different purposes of grants. Like there might be like grants that are, or easements rather, that are more about like agricultural usage or whatever. Mine is about protection of biodiversity. And so I am allowed to manage the forest as long as I'm managing it with that as my like main intent is to protect biodiversity. Hunting's allowed. I did make it so that public access is allowed forever. And that was for me just like an equity thing because I was just recognizing that like not everybody, most people don't get the privilege to own big pieces of land. And we got to make it so that people have places to go, even if you don't own, a piece of land where you can be out in the woods, which is also, that was a big compromise because I also feel like it feels very personal to me, and the idea of people being all over it is scary.
Yeah.
But also, I think is really representative of a lot of these big compromises that we need to make. And
Yeah.
we're managing these ecosystems for a lot of different things. We're managing them for biodiversity. We're managing them for water. We're managing them for air and climate mitigation, and we're also managing them for people. And so trying to strike that balance, I think is and make those compromises is really, really important. The interesting thing about conservation, though, with here in Vermont, at least, with agricultural conservation, what they'll do is they'll do an appraisal and they'll be like, this is your land unconserved, this is your land conserved. And then the difference between those values is the value of your easement. And if it's agricultural land, they might give you a check for that amount of money and compensate you for that difference in value. With forest land, there's just like no funding for that. And so there was a time period where I was like, I don't know if I can afford to give away hundreds of thousands of dollars of value in my land because I'd have to pay a land trust $20,000 to, do all of their legal expenses and to monitor that easement in perpetuity and to, if some future person violates the easement, to like take them to court or whatever. So I ended up working with a local land trust that I was able to do it, for like nothing.
Awesome.
But it was an interesting thing where I'm like, what is this world where, I feel like I'm doing something which is for everybody, and which is this great act of, caring for these values that we all share. It's something that if you want to give away that value, you have to pay this exorbitant amount of money to do it. That felt out of alignment with me.
Yeah. No good deed goes unpunished, right?
Right. Yeah, it's definitely, it can't be that way.
Yeah. And I thank you for doing it. I think it's great that you did that. And I do think there are probably quite a few listeners that have thought about the idea of the land trust, and it's an intimidating thing for all the reasons you've pointed out.
Yeah.
The cost, which there's attorneys involved, so it's never going to be cheap.
Mm-hmm.
The perpetuity component of it,
Mm-hmm.
there's just a lot to it.
Yeah, it's scary.
Yeah, so I appreciate you talking about it a little bit. So this book came out, last year? I know you said you are working on some new stuff, but it won't be out for a little while.
Mm-hmm.
Where can people get your book?
Anywhere the books are sold. I mean, I always tell people, if you got a choice, go support your local independent bookstore. You can get it anywhere, and you can get it as a hardcover, ebook, audiobook. But I've had such a fun time, on this book tour, doing just like hanging out in libraries and independent bookstores, which are, I've realized, incredibly radical spaces, especially
Yeah.
in this, like, those are not easy things to be
Mm,
right now. And they're both radical in different ways. So go support your local independent bookstore. They're like the best places in the world.
absolutely. And you're on social media as well, so people can follow you on Instagram. I don't know if you're on Facebook.
Yep.
I'm assuming you're on TikTok,
TikTok, YouTube,
but I don't use TikTok, so
and it's all under at How to Love a Forest.
yeah, which somehow I think we made this whole episode without actually saying the book name. So yes, it is called How to Love a Forest. It'll be in the show notes. Ethan, this has been really great. I'm really excited to see your next book come out. It was a really fantastic read. I'm definitely going to be recommending it to a few folks. And if you haven't read it before, please, if you're listening, go check it out.
Thank you so much for having me.
Ethan, thank you.
Thank you.